Hello, class. Today is day 10 of George's Marvelous Medicine. When we last left off, George and his father were making a new Marvelous Medicine so they could practice and then sell it to everybody. They had just finished mixing up the mixture. They'd gotten stuff from the bathroom. They'd gotten stuff from the laundry room. They got the medicine from the animals and some brown paint. But I kind of have a feeling that they forgot something. So they mix it up and they're ready to go feed it to the chickens. Mr. Cranky is super excited. He just sees money, money, money in his future. Everybody else is a little bit less certain. Outside in the yard, there were several chickens that hadn't had any of George's Marvelous Medicine number 1. That's the one he originally made. They were pecking about in the dirt in that silly way chickens do. George crouched down, holding a spoonful out of George's Marvelous Medicine number 2. "Come on, chicken," he said. "Good chicken. Chick, chick, chick." A white chicken with black specks on its feathers looked up at George. It walked over to the spoon and went peck. The effect that medicine number 2 had on the chicken was not quite the same as the effect produced by medicine number 1, but it was very interesting. So here is George feeding the medicine to the chicken. "Whoosh!" shrieked the chicken, and it shot up 6 feet in the air and came down. Then sparks came out of its beak, bright yellow sparks of fire, as though someone was sharpening a knife on a grindstone inside its tummy. Then its legs began to grow longer. Its body stayed the same size, but the 2 thin yellow legs got longer and longer and longer, and longer still. "What's happening to it?" cried Mr. Killiecranky. "Something's wrong," George said. The legs went on growing, and the more they grew, the higher up into the air went the chicken's body. When the legs were about 15 feet long, they stopped growing. The chicken looked perfectly absurd, with its long, long legs and its ordinary little body perched up high up on the top, like a chicken on stilts. So here is a picture of the tall, tall chicken with its regular body. I have a feeling that George's dad won't like that very much. "Oh, my sainted ants!" cried Mr. Killiecranky. "We've got it all wrong. This chicken is no good to anybody. It's all legs. Nobody wants chicken legs." "I must have left something out," George said. "I know you've left something out," cried Mr. Cranky. "Think, boy, think. What was it you left out?" "I've got it," George said. "What was it? Quick." "Flea powder for dogs," George said. "You mean you put flea powder in the first one?" "Yes, Dad, I did. A whole carton of it." "Then that's the answer." "Wait a minute," George said. "Did we have brown shoe polish on our list?" "We did not," said Mr. Cranky. "I used that too," said George. "Well, no wonder it went all wrong," said Mr. Cranky. He was already running to his car, and soon he was heading down to the village to buy more flea powder and more shoe polish. Chapter 13. Marvelous Medicine number 3. "Here it is!" cried Mr. Killiecranky, rushing into the kitchen. 1 carton of flea powder for dogs and 1 can of brown shoe polish. George poured the flea powder into the giant stewing pot. Then he scooped out the shoe polish of its can and adding it as well. "Stir it up, George," shouted Mr. Cranky, "and give it another boil. We've got it this time. I'll bet we've got it." After Marvelous Medicine number 3 had been boiled and stirred, George took a cupful of it out to the yard and tried it on another chicken. Mr. Cranky ran after him, flapping his arms and hopping with excitement. "Come on, watch this one," he called out to Mrs. Cranky. Come on, watch us turning an ordinary chicken into a lovely, great, big one that lays eggs as large as football. I hope you do better than last time. Mrs. Cranky followed them out. Come on, chicken, George said, holding out the spoonful of medicine number 3. Good chicken, chick, 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 chick. Have some of this lovely medicine. A magnificent black chicken with a scarlet comb came stepping over. The chicken looked at the spoon and went peck. Cock-a-doodle-doo! Squawked the rooster, shouting up into the air and coming down again. Watch him now, cried Mr. Cranky. Watch him grow. Any moment he's going to start getting bigger and bigger. Mrs. Killycranky, and little George stood in the yard staring at the black rooster. Then the rooster stood quite still. It looked as though it had a headache. What's happening to its neck? Mrs. Cranky said. It's getting longer, George said. I'll say it's getting longer, Mrs. Cranky said. Mr. Cranky, for once, said nothing. So here is the chicken with the neck that's getting longer. Last time it was the legs, Mrs. Cranky said. Now it's the neck. Who wants a chicken with a long neck? You can't eat a chicken's neck. It was an extraordinary sight. The rooster's body hadn't grown at all, but now the neck was about 6 feet long. Here is the picture of the chicken with its very, very long neck. All right, George, Mr. Cranky said. What else have you forgotten? I don't know, George said. Oh, yes, you do, Mr. Cranky said. Come on, boy, think. There's probably just one vital thing missing, and you've got to remember. I put some engine oil from the garage, George said. Do you have that on your list? Eureka! Cried Mr. Cranky. That's the answer. How much did you put in? Half a pint, George said. He forgot that he went to the garage in general. He missed that whole room. Mr. Cranky ran to the garage and found another half pint of oil. And some antifreeze, George called after him. I sloshed in a bit of antifreeze. Chapter 14. Marvelous Medicine, number 4. Back in the kitchen once again, George, with Mr. Cranky, watching him anxiously, tipped half a pint of engine oil and some antifreeze into the giant stewing pot. Boil it up again, cried Mr. Cranky. Boil it and stir it. George boiled it and stirred it. You'll never get it right, said Mrs. Cranky. Don't forget you don't just have the same things, but you have to have the exact same amounts of those things. And how can you possibly do that? You keep out of this, cried Mr. Cranky. We're doing fine. We've got this time. You will see we have it. This was George's Marvelous Medicine number 4, and it had boiled for a couple minutes. George, once again, carried a cupful of it out into the yard. Mr. Cranky ran after him. Mrs. Cranky followed more slowly. You're going to have some mighty weird chickens around here if you go on like this, she said. Dish it out, George, cried Mr. Cranky. Give a spoonful of it to the one over there. He pointed to a brown hen. George knelt down and held the spoon with the new medicine in it. Chick, chick, he said. Try some of this. The brown hen walked over and looked at the spoon, and then it went peck. Ouch, it said. Then a funny whistling noise came out of its beak. Watch it grow, shouted Mr. Cranky. Don't be so sure, said Mrs. Cranky. Why is it whistling like that? Keep quiet, woman, Mr. Cranky cried. Give it a chance. They stood there staring at the brown hen. It's getting smaller, George said. Look at it, Dad. It's shrinking. And indeed it was. In less than a minute, the hen had shrunk so much that it was no bigger than a new hatched chick. It looked ridiculous. Here is a picture of the tiny hen next to George and his mom and his dad. Chapter 15. Goodbye, Grandma. There is still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it would be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. She's a bit of a fixed mindset kind of lady. Mr. Cranky looked over very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up, too. He was still kneeling on the ground with the spoon in one hand and the cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the three people below her and shouted, What's going on around here? Why hasn't anybody brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough to have to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blown away if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast. Sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you some right away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Ho, ho, she cried. Ha, ha! So that's your game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? Make quite sure you've got a nice cup of tea in the morning. But you didn't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig. There's Grandma bending down to yell at George. You can see she's so tall and has to bend all the way over. No, Grandma, George said. This isn't... Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here this minute. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. Now you're against me, too? Grandma shouted. My own daughter, trying to stop me from having my breakfast. Trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height, reaching up a huge hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, Grandma, no, George cried out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's marvelous. Everything's George's around here, shouted Grandma. George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the little cup out of George's hand and carried it high out of reach. Drink up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, the other two cried. No, no, no. But it was too late. The ancient old beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's marvelous medicine number 4. And look what one tiny spoonful did to the brown hen. But George's grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. So here is George's grandma drinking the tea way up high. The tea, the medicine. And there's George and his mom and his dad looking on from down below. We have a few pages left. We will finish next time, and then you can take an AR test on this book if you haven't done it in previous years.